I've been thinking about the bracket system and thought it would be interesting to explore it by taking a single commander and showcasing how a deck for it could look at each level of the system. I decided to do Sisay, Weatherlight Captain, for this because I've ran a lot of different versions of her over the years, including shrines as well as generic legendaries, aka Legos, and now she is my only cEDH commander. Thus, I feel like I have experience of playing her across a good swath of the bracket system already and should be able to build viable decks at each bracket. Because she's currently constructed as cEDH, I'm going to start with my bracket 5 version of Sisay and then work backwards from there until I get to a bracket 1 deck. At which point, I'll show you the Skyship Weatherlight, super thematic, ultra jank version of my Sisay EDH bracket 1 deck. For those not familiar with Sisay, Weatherlight Captain, she's a 3-mana 2/2, which gets +1/+1 for each color among other legendary permanents you control. She also has an activate ability which costs Wooburg and allows you to tutor into play a legendary permanent card with a mana value less than her power. For example, if she's a 2/2, I can pay 5 to tutor Ragavan into play, at which point she becomes a 3/3. I could then activate her again to tutor for a 2-drop, such as Kinnan Bonder Prodigy, at which point she would become a 5/5. My Sisay cEDH deck, like almost all cEDH decks, is a combo deck, specifically combo control. So although I have control pieces like Airtight, Resurrected, Teferi, Time Raveler I can tutor up, the ultimate goal is to build towards some combo line which normally involves at least one other legendary permanent. For example, this deck can make infinite mana doing something like Emil the Blessed, Bloom Tender, and Tyvar Jubilant Brawler, and then maybe grab Derevi and Mount Doom and repeatedly bounce Derevi to infinite untap Mount Doom, and then do infinite activations of Mount Doom to kill all my opponents. Or I can also infinite bounce Orcish Bowmasters for the same result. That's just 2 of the many combo lines the deck has, and there are far too many to mention here, and honestly, I'm not sure even I know all the combo lines in the deck, but there are guides online if you want to read about them all. Now, because it's in 5 colors, I run the vast majority of all the best cards in the format. I run 13 Game Changers, most of the free and 1-mana counterspells, and all the relevant cheap tutors like Eldorami's Call, Enlightened Tutor, Worldly Tutor, Demonic Tutor, and Vampiric Tutor. Because this also runs just about all the best mana rocks and mana dorks in the game, by turn 2 or 3 it pretty reliably produces between 4 and 6 mana and can likely counterspell people along the way. From there, it usually isn't hard to get Sisay out and start tutoring for either my combos or some pieces to protect Sisay, and because her ability is an activate ability, it's very hard to interact with. For lands, I run 29, which is mostly just 9 revised duels, 10 fetches, and anything that can tap for all of my colors. But I also have Gemstone's Cavern, Gaia's Cradle, and 2 of the Kamigawa Channel lands. Now, how can we turn this from a 5 into a 4? One of my friends pointed out the biggest difference between tier 5 and 4 is vibes. And when I read the bracket description, it basically just said, these decks are as competitive as they want to be without being part of a cEDH metagame. So I decided to just ask ChatGPT what it thinks the difference is. Mostly, it seems to think that there is less of an emphasis on hyper efficiency. The deck shouldn't be built around early game combos, though it can still combo off early on, and it can additionally include battlecruiser style game finishers you normally wouldn't see in cEDH. I think that's a reasonable definition, so I started by dropping the tutors that exist only to fetch me the non-legendary pieces needed for infinite combos: Eldorami's Call, Eldritch Evolution, Enlightened Tutor, and Worldly Tutor. But I left in the 2 black tutors that get anything, as I don't only use those for combos. I also dropped Dispel, Mental Misstep, Mindbreak Trap, and Flusterstorm, because there's likely going to be less need for these very narrow counterspells in bracket 4. Silence is also dropped since I'm less worried about combo, and I removed Colossal Sky Turtle and Touch the Spirit Realm since these exist largely because they're hard to interact with in the cEDH metagame, and Monologue Tax I always find disappointing, so I dropped that also. Lastly, I removed Orcish Bowmasters as it's an off-theme combo piece, and Gilded Drake because I won't be able to rely on stealing other people's combo pieces in Bracket 4 EDH the way I can in the more narrow Bracket 5 format. I also dropped the 9 revised duels and added in 10 Shocklands. This probably won't have a big impact on the power level of the deck, but it feels more Bracket 4 to me to use Shocklands. And the last land I dropped was Gemstone Caverns, because losing the card for it feels bad, and I'm not trying to accelerate out of the gate quite that fast. For adding in lands, on top of the shocks, I added in Minamo, School at Water's Edge, and Takenuma, Abandoned Mire, because they give us some value plays. And lastly, I added the World Tree because it's a pet card I like to run in 5-color decks for the easy color fixing. This increased the overall land count by 3 and got it up to 32. For the 9 remaining cards, I started with Lavinia, Azorius Renegade, and Drana and Linvala to increase the stacks element of the deck. I also added in Jegantha, Catilda, and Ruby for mana generation. Because we're going harder into the legendary theme, I wanted Urza's Ruinous Blast as an asymmetric board wipe, and I also added Kethis, Joyra, and Joda, as these provide a lot of value in legendary tribal. The last one, Joda, will also make winning with combat damage more viable, which isn't normally something you can do in cEDH. Lastly, I added in Ireth of the Healing House, as it enables some multi-card combos, and Sakashima the Imposter, which can be used to do things like clone our opponent's Atali. So overall, this deck is now much less optimized for tutoring up early game combos and casting mana efficient counterspells, but I added in another combo piece I can grab with Sisay, and it's leaned into the legendary theme for a bit of extra value. To me, this deck feels like a good representation of a Bracket 4 deck because although it wouldn't be appropriate for a cEDH tournament, I could probably play it against other cEDH decks and not be totally out of my league. Now, moving this down to Bracket 3 should be even easier, as there are more explicit rules. In addition to only being able to run 3 game changers, the expectation is that I can't easily combo in the first 6 turns of the game, though it is acceptable to win longer games out of nowhere with game-ending combos. First, I want to get down to only running 3 game changers. Of the 14 in the Bracket 4 deck list, 3 are legendary: Gaia's Cradle, Kinnan, and the One Ring. So I just kept those 3 and dropped the rest, which are Ancient Tomb, Chrome Mox, Cyclonic Rift, Demonic Tutor, Fierce Guardianship, Mana Vault, Mox Diamond, Opposition Agent, Rhystic Study, Smothering Tithe, and Vampiric Tutor. I was not sad to see any of these cards leave the deck. Personally, when it comes to casual EDH, I'm kind of fatigued by seeing these cards, and I'm happy to remove them to put in cards more related to a theme. I think this is part of the point of Bracket 3 in the Game Changer system, and in doing this, I realized I appreciate how with this system, I got to keep the 3 game changers that are actually on theme for my deck without feeling pressured to include 11 more generically good cards unrelated to my deck's theme. In addition to the game changers, the ability to combo early game is discouraged, and because Sisay is herself a tutor, I also removed Saheeli, Oath of Teferi, and Animatu because these could be tutored up fairly early using Sisay's ability. Additionally, I dropped Lotus Petal and Mox Opal because I'm not trying to shove in every possible fast mana card in this deck. Lastly, I cut Swan Song because it's already hard enough to interact with Sisay's ability, and I don't think it's going to feel good or fun for other players if I use a 1-mana counterspell. For additions, because I lost a lot of mana efficiency and also dropped some mana rocks, I upped the land count from 31 to 37. For the 6 lands I added, I stayed on theme and did 5 legendary lands: Minas Tirith, Rivendell, Shizo, Death's Storehouse, Urborg, Tome of Yawgmoth, and Yavimaya, Cradle of Growth, plus Plaza of Heroes, as it's also closely related to the legendary theme. Running legendary lands will help me get more value out of cards like Yoshimaru and Shanid, which I also added, and to me that kind of value and synergy is one of the defining aspects of more casual EDH. Next, I wanted to make this deck more combat viable, so I added Arvad, Elish Norn, Day of Destiny, and Flowering of the White Tree to buff our legendary creatures. I also wanted to protect my deck from board wipes since those are going to be more common at Bracket 3, so Hajar and Boromir were added in as well. Because a lot of the card draw was dropped, I also added in Reki, Basim, Vraska Joins Up, and the Great Henge. Lastly, I added in Shalai, because I like how she protects my own stuff and has an ability I can dump mana into. So in summary, I took out a lot of the combo potential and removed all the off-theme game changers, and added in a lot of value and synergy, and made the deck more combat-oriented. Now on to Bracket 2. Bracket 2 also has some explicit rules on what cards you can't run, so the first few cuts will be easy. However, the Bracket 2 definition says the easiest reference for what is in this bracket is the average pre-constructed deck. I'm not sure what average means in this regard, because in my experience there is a huge range in the power level of pre-con decks, especially between sets. For example, most recently I purchased the Fallout precons and played the Dr. Madison Lee deck, and I liked the deck thematically a lot, but Wizards says Bracket 2 decks should have the potential for strong engines and big splashy plays, but with Dr. Madison Lee, even when I had 15 cards out, it felt like I was struggling to get the deck to make meaningful plays, and the engine it had was quite weak. I think if I played the deck against my friend's normal, non-precon Bracket 2 decks, it would lose every single game and have virtually no chance of winning. On the other side of that, many of my friends purchased the Warhammer precons, and even the out-of-the-box precons felt like they could compete with many of the existing decks in our playgroup. I think some of those decks like Be'lakor are almost at Bracket 3, but Dr. Madison Lee was probably closer to Bracket 1. So this Bracket 2 I make will end up being more at the power level of a Be'lakor than a Dr. Madison Lee. So first I dropped the remaining 3 game changers, Gaia's Cradle, the One Ring, and Kinnan. I also dropped the remaining free to cast spells, Deadly Rollick and Deflecting Swat, because I want to move further away from efficient cards and even further towards value and synergy. Tyvar and Emil were also cut, as those two enable infinite combos, and given that the commander can tutor them up, that feels very unfair for Bracket 2. Next, I cut out most of the non-legendary non-land permanents, especially the Mana Dorks and Mana Rocks. So that means I cut Sol Ring, Arcane Signet, and Felwar Stone, but left in Relic of Legends because it's on theme even without being a legendary permanent. For creatures, I cut Birds of Paradise, Bloomtender, Deathrite Shaman, Enduring Vitality, Esper Sentinel, Fey Burrower Elder, Ignoble Hierarch, and Noble Hierarch. I left in Delighted Halfling for the same reason as Relic of Legends, and I also want some anti-counterspell tech because in my experience, a lot of randos in lower power pods will have counterspell heavy decks, and I don't like getting counterspelled, especially when the players counterspell me over and over but have no real long-term game plan and end up losing because they run out of cards casting counter magic against my stuff. So now to get into additions. I went down 1 land due to losing Gaia's Cradle, and because I lost so much mana efficiency and fast mana and Mana Dorks, I needed to increase the land count. Also, playing 10 fetches and 10 shocks and Mana Confluence doesn't feel very Bracket 2 to me, so I rebuilt the mana base using Triomes, Checklands, and Basics. Next, because part of EDH is ramping, I added in the 3 2-mana ramp spells that can fetch based on land type, 3 Visits, Nature's Lore, and Farseek. Also, I added Explore as more 2-mana ramp. Tempwith Discovery and the Ring Goes South are also good cards I included. The Ring Goes South is especially strong in a Legos creature deck, and will have the potential to get us a lot of lands into play. This gave me room for 7 more cards. Those could have been pretty much any legendary, so I just added in 6 random legendaries that appealed to me. Primeval's Glorious Rebirth, the Wanderer, Surok, Dragonclaw, Maelstrom Wanderer, Jurina, and Wrath Caption, Ship's Mage. And the last card is Legacy Weapon, which is the inspiration for the on-theme Bracket 1 jank version of this deck. Ultimately, for this Bracket 2 list, we got the speed down a lot, removed the combos, and leaned hard into the legendary theme. Admittedly, I think this deck is probably still kind of on the strong side and should be able to crush any average precon. However, I think if this went against a table of 3 of the stronger precons, then those 3 players should have a good chance against this deck as long as they coordinate against me. Now, on to Bracket 1. The difference between Bracket 1 and Bracket 2, much like the difference between Bracket 4 and Bracket 5, is largely about vibes. With this deck, we're going to be tutoring up some very awful cards from Magic's past that really just aren't that good, but we will run them because they're related to the story of the skyship Weatherlight. Whereas before I started with discussing the cuts, I'm going to start this with discussing the adds. The priority here is Weatherlight related cards. So first off, that's characters like Karn and Urza, the Weatherlight itself, as well as various cards that happen to depict the Weatherlight in its art, such as Capsize and Captain's Maneuver. We're also going to prioritize cards which have Sisay in the art, including of course Captain Sisay, as well as really janky cards like Ancestral Knowledge. Now, I don't want to sit here and list off every single card since I changed 41, but some of these cards do have hilarious synergies worth mentioning, which I think demonstrate the pure janky synergy of Bracket 1 EDH. For example, Sisay's Ingenuity is a 1-mana aura that draws you a card when it enters, and gives a creature the ability to change the color of another creature. Weirdly enough, this actually works with our commander, since she cares about the amount of colors among our legendary creatures. Also, we have Tiana, Ship's Caretaker, which allows us to return our auras and equipment which are sent to the graveyard back to hand. So if anyone were to try to destroy this horrible card, Sisay's Ingenuity, we can actually use Sisay's ability to instant speed tutor up Tiana and get Sisay's Ingenuity back. There's also a lot of hilarious synergy in the deck because we have Mind Over Matter, which is on theme. So we can do fun things like use Stark of Wrath repeatedly to blow up as many of our opponent's artifacts and creatures we have cards for. Or we can make a really bad play like discarding our hand so we can repeatedly use Orym's Samite Healer. Also with Timeless Lotus and Thran Tome, we can infinite mill ourselves out. Now I don't know why we would want to, but we can, maybe to dig for an artifact or enchantment which we can't tutor for, then return it to play using Hannah, Ship's Navigator. Originally, I wanted to add Second Chance to this deck, but unfortunately that's not allowed in Bracket 1. I think it would have been hilarious to have very narrow circumstances in which you could take infinite turns using it and Hannah, Ship's Navigator, and possibly this is a situation where you could run cards like this, but then tell people, this is a Bracket 1 deck, but I have a way to make infinite turns, though it's using Second Chance, so it's very difficult for me to ever get it off. There's also other cards that could work well with Second Chance, like Captain's Maneuver and Restrain, which could set you up for using it. So there'd actually be some fun ways to try to maneuver yourself into having the right amount of life you need to start off this combo. Anyways, there are some other cards I discovered by doing this which I think are interesting, such as Mercadia's Downfall. Not only can I use this to buff Sisay to allow her to tutor for something larger, but this actually feels like a really good combat trick in EDH. I could see running it in a lot of go-wide aggro decks as a 3-mana alternative to something like Craterhoof Behemoth. There are some pretty thematic adds in this deck too. I really like Distorting Wake, Strafe, and Vindicate because they all feature the Weatherlight engaging the enemy. Lastly, I have the lands. I wasn't sure exactly how to make the lands more thematic, so I cut lands like the Lord of the Rings ones which felt like they clashed, and I added in more basics and specifically chose the basics that have the Skyship Weatherlight in the art. I also removed the triomes and added back in the revised duels, because the duels feel more appropriate given the era of Magic most of these cards are from. So that's my construction of the Weatherlight deck involving the Weatherlight crew and Weatherlight themed cards. The more I look at this deck, the more I want to play this old school Magic style, and it also makes me want to research the Weatherlight lore further so I can figure out even more thematic includes. In fact, if any of you have ideas on important thematic cards I missed for this deck, I'd love to hear about it in the comments. Otherwise, smash that like button and hopefully I see you next time.